Hello, everybody. My name's David Matthew, and on this channel, I help you develop the mindsets and tactics of a product leader so that you can create and collaborate with confidence. On today's video, I'm going to share a talk that I recently gave at the local ProductTank meetup here in Indianapolis. The title of the talk is The Principles for Empowered Product Teams. It's not just one talk, but it's a series of topics that really I have a lot of passion, a lot of interest in talking about. So I encourage you to leave some comments, subscribe to this channel. There's going to be more content coming along the lines of what you see in this presentation. And check out the links for related descriptions for some of the content mentioned in the video, and as well as where you can reach me and to find more information. So check out the description for the links. A couple of real short things before we get to the video content. I just wanted to give a thanks to SEP for hosting the March meetup. SEP is a product design and development company located in Carmel, Indiana. It's where I currently work. I've been at the company for about 14 years now, so quite a long time. It's a pretty great place to work. If you're looking for a job in design or software development, you should check us out. Also, if you have a need for any kind of custom software development, whether you're a startup or a scale up or a very large enterprise, we do all kinds of different custom software work. So if you're looking for custom software, give SEP a look. It's www.sep.com. And then the last thing, just wanted to mention where this this talk is given at. This is the local ProductTank meetup here in Indianapolis. ProductTank is a global organization to help bring all kinds of people together that are interested in product management. So it's for people new to product management, people experienced with product management. It kind of encompasses everyone. So if you're interested in product management or software or developing products or design, definitely check out ProductTank and their related Mind the Product conference. And again, we have a local group here in Indianapolis. So I'm one of the organizers for that. I would encourage you to check out the meetup page. We have a Slack channel that you could join to meet and talk to people. There's people in there to talk to. So if you'd like an invite to that, get in touch with me or any of the organizers, and we can get you set up with that. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the talk. Again, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out, but I will let you get to the talk.
All right, so what I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight is what I call the principles of empowered product teams. So I think this sounds hopefully it'll sound familiar, because last meetup we talked about Marty Kagan article and kind of a series of articles that he's had talking about empowered teams and what does that mean and how does that kind of impact people that are doing product. So over the years, I've kind of learned and saw a lot of things, and as I've learned and seen a lot of things, they tend to start to fall into categories or buckets. I sort of think of like, how would I start categorizing the types of things that I'm seeing that are interesting? And these are some of the names for the buckets that I've came up with that I think are good groupings to show. So the first two are more about setting up an environment for success. So what is kind of how do you make a fertile ground for the product that you're going to grow, right? What goes into that? And so that I think is the categories of alignment and teaming. And then there's also this secondary part for creating and sustaining momentum. And so we'll talk about habits as process, traction and optionality, and feedback, like what feedback means. And these things are not meant to be a checklist of like, here's the things you need to do to accomplish things in this category. It's really more of a set of categories or a set of attitudes or mindsets. Like if you're starting to have a problem, you're starting to notice something on your team or with your product, it will probably fall into one of these categories, and it gives you kind of a way to categorize and think about what that issue is, and then what kind of tools or ideas that you would bring to help make a difference in it. So, and like I said, these kind of break into these two categories. So I call the first one strategic enablement, And then that allows for thoughtful, deliberate execution. And what that really means in a little bit more English words is have the right environment so that you can do the right actions. And you tie these two things together by having the right habits. So I'll talk a little bit about the first one. First one is alignment. So, and I like to give this idea of vectors. So if people are familiar with physics, high school physics or basic physics, we talk about forces as vectors. So forces have both a magnitude, an amount, what they're putting, like how much it is, but then also a direction. And if you do start doing these kind of physics problems, you'll start breaking them down into, like, you have a diagonal of a force, but then it splits into two parts. So like, where is it operating in the X? Where is it operating in the Y? And then if you try to put two vectors together, you're kind of adding the things along the vertical and adding the things along the horizontal. And that's how you kind of put those two things together, right? So I like to think about this in the concept of people or the effort that you're spending on projects. So if you have lots of people, you can think of those as all of these little arrows of your vectors. But if you think about what are the people doing, what direction are they moving in, what are they putting effort into, how much effort are they putting in? And if you start thinking about it kind of in this vector concept, the things that they're doing that are good is moving in one direction, and the things that are kind of not in that direction is probably some form of waste, right? It's effort that is being expended by people or your company, but it's not actually moving the needle. It's not building momentum for the team or the product. So as we kind of think about these, think about how part of it is eliminating the waste, becoming more well aligned so that you're getting more efficiency and you're kind of all pushing in the same direction together. So that kind of leads to asking the next question of, like, what direction are you pushing in? How do you know that? How do you kind of have this mindset around what are you aligning things around? And the thing I'd like to encourage you to think about is this idea of playing the infinite game. Simon Sinek just came out with a new book called The Infinite Game. There was a book a while ago that had the same concept in it. But he talks about, like, basketball game, there's a score, there's a clear set of players, there's a clear objective, it's very clear rules on who wins and how long it's going to take and all that stuff, right? But if you think about the real world and most things that aren't a very well-defined definition of a team, like, winning means something different, or it's kind of ambiguous. It doesn't mean anything. So what does it mean to win at business, or to win at marriage, or to win at life, or like there is no winning, right? The goal is to keep playing, to stay married, to stay in business, to stay alive, right? To survive. So like, think about it from that concept. I mean, winning is important. You need to have wins as you go, but if those wins aren't aligning to keep you playing, then you're probably not thinking kind of with the right long-term strategic mindset. So that's where I like to think a little bit like your attention acts like a spotlight. So where are you focusing at when you're setting a direction for a team? You're kind of spotlighting things. You're saying, like, where am I going to put my time and energy into? What am I not going to put my time and energy into? And there's an analogy from the military called the commander's intent. So you don't tell troops exactly what they're going to do. You give them a concept of a mission, a hill to take, and then you let them figure out what is the right tools and tactics and approach. And then you leverage the creativity of those individuals to actually make a difference to get the result, but you don't spell everything out for them. And that will come into the next section we'll talk about. Also, having this kind of spotlighting or focusing effect allows you to have some room for uncertainty, and it encourages autonomy and creativity on your teams. So like, having that kind of a concept for your alignment, like, it's direction of what you're doing, direction of what you're not doing, but kind of just some guardrails so people have kind of a mental model to focus their work around. I like to kind of think about strategy a little bit like this. If you're familiar with the games like Civ or StarCraft, or like these like real-time strategy games, like, you'll see this common kind of paradigm in gaming where you start out in some area with a base where you're at, and you can kind of see everything. It's lit up. You have little guys you can move around, but everywhere else there's like clouds obscuring it. it's like in the darkness, right? It's the fog of war. So some parts of it, you know what's going on, and the other parts you don't know. And you don't know until you go into, once you venture a little unit out into that space, like the clouds go away and you get to see like what's there, right? I know it's StarCraft or some of these other ones. If you go away, it kind of grays out, so you can see like what it was the last time you were there, but you have to go back into the area to actually see what it's like now, right? So there's kind of this idea of that uncertainty is a thing. It's unavoidable. You can't know everything, and so you have to have some idea of what you're doing without actually knowing what's behind the fog, right? And sometimes you have to venture into the fog of war to actually see what's there, to decide, are you going to keep going? Are you going to pivot? Was that the right direction? Was it not? So I think this is just kind of a useful way to think about alignment. Another topic that I think is useful for this is this concept of RPV. So this comes from Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Solution. I had coffee a couple of years ago with Ryan Singer from Basecamp up in Chicago, and I asked him, like, what are some things that have influenced you or have been impactful to you? And this was one of the things that he said kind of had really stuck with him. And the idea behind this is that how well you do as a business depends on the alignment of these three things. So what are you, like, where are you investing resources, time, money, people's energy or people's time, or your equipment or other things like that. Are there processes that are supporting the things that you want to get done, that are helping to utilize those resources effectively? And then what does the organization value? So and these things have to kind of line up, right? So if you have the right people and the right processes, but they're focused on the wrong thing, or you have the wrong incentive structures in your organization, like, things can go off the rails. If you incentivize people well and you have a decent process, but you have the wrong people, that can be a problem. If you have good people and a good values, but your processes are terrible and you have a lot of red tape and everything's difficult or bogged down, then it's going to be hard to get anything done, right? So if you can kind of bucket things into these areas and think about, are these things well aligned with each other? And like, how would we know that those things are well aligned or make improvements to it? So then I have some kind of framing questions here. So can everyone on your team see clear connections between the customer needs and product features within the constraints of the business? And then some other things that you could ask in this area. Can you name a single primary mission that you're trying to accomplish? Can you summarize that? I think one of the problems we have a lot of times is that businesses have too many objectives, and we're kind of think about those vectors, right? If your forces are applied in many different areas, you're not going to be very, very effective. So what can we do? Like, can you name a single objective? Can you move things into more of an aligned focus? Are you being given problems to solve or tasks to complete? What does this look like in your environment? So like what does it look like for your teams? Are you just given the to-dos, or are you given more of that hill to take, kind of an objective to achieve, and then the team has some more creativity around how they use their skills to do that? When you're doing work, is the difference between facts and assumptions clear? Is the work based off assumptions treated differently? I think that's a lot of times I see a lot of people make the mistake of that there's no distinction between facts and guesses, right? And a lot of time, I think that's critical, because if something is known and we have information that tells us why we think that that's true, and we're pretty confident in it, then we don't need to do a whole lot of research and kind of discovery effort and thought work into it. We just kind of need to make a plan and move on it, right? But if it's, I think this was a good idea, and it's an assumption, then the type of work that you would do is different, right? You would do some investigatory work, you would do some experiments, you would do some other things to kind of move forward. So like, how can you think about your process and where you maybe add some clarity around assumptions versus facts? So the next kind of big bucket, and this is again kind of in that strategic alignment part, is this idea of teaming. So there's this really great TED Talk by Amy Edmondson, who's a Harvard researcher on teaming. And so she says that teaming is teamwork on the fly. And she talks a little bit about the traditional definition of a team. which is, the more of a sports team. Like it's a set group of individuals with a set objective, a set part of rules, and like that's just not how a lot of times product teams or businesses are operating, right? It's more of a a moving structure. It's teamwork on the fly is how she defines what teaming is. And then one of the things she says is the fundamental human challenge is it's hard to learn when you already know. So this gets part of this idea of teaming is not just doing teamwork on the fly, but what does the environment on your team look like? How is your team operating? Like, what does it feel like to be a member of your team? And this kind of starts to get to the attitude, right? So if you think you have all the answers, your mind is kind of closed off to learning more or discovering new information or being more willing to collaborate with other people because you think you have it, all figured out. And so I don't need your help, right? Because I got all the answers. So she says that teams that team well. So what does it mean to team well? She says you need to be humble in the face of the challenge ahead. So there's this humility aspect. I don't have all the answers. I'm curious and I want to try to figure it out. And so you're both curious about discovering more about the problem and also what other people on your teams are bringing to the table. And then you also need to be willing to take risks to move and learn quickly. And thank you, Diana, for sharing the link. And so a couple other things just to kind of touch on for this topic. So think about how you make decisions on your teams. I can see like this can be a real point of contention around like who is the decision maker on your team. And it's not that there's a right way to do it. It's just, is it clear what the process is? Like you could be in an environment where maybe a founder or somebody higher up on an org chart like is just, it's the hippo concept. Like they make the calls and what they say goes. That's fine. Just being clear that like that's the mode of operation so that you can frame the other things that you're doing around that. You could also have a team that is, very, that hill to take kind of thing. Somebody tells you, oh, team, you need to solve this problem, right? So great, we have lots of autonomy and creativity direction on the team. Well, if you give the team a problem to solve, but then the team has no clear decision maker or process for decision making, then you get chaos on the team, right? Because then it's individuals trying to compete for winning with their ideas. It's not, so it just gets to be hard. So you just need to be clear about, is there a person on the team then that's appointed for the decision making? Is it based off of does somebody own like a type of work? Like we're doing this thing and you're the owner of it this time and this other person's the owner some other time. Or it could be a part of the process. Maybe there is some set of activities that you do that then walk you through making a decision as a team. So, so there's lots of things to think about here. But is it clear is kind of the big takeaway in this area. And then the other part is like getting getting the best out of people, right? So, and this gets into the humility and curiosity. Like, do people have the right mindset? Are they forcing their thoughts and views on the team, or are they trying to understand and learn and like gain perspective from other people? And are you encouraging people to do that? So when you're on a team, are people actively encouraged to share their opinions, or I think we should do this, or this it would be better for the user if this thing happened, or there's all these different manifestations of that. But you want people to be excited to do that, right? And because the minute you say like, oh no, that doesn't matter, we're just going to move on. If that feels like a personal loss to that person, then you're going to start getting disengagement, right? Like my opinion doesn't matter. What I say doesn't count. Like my ideas are never heard, right? So like it's about building this culture where it feels like you want to contribute. And then you also have the flip side of that people, once they're heard, they're mature enough to be able to say, okay, my idea didn't win, but I understand that and I'm kind of buying into it, right? So that disagree and commit. So like, I know I've shared my thing and I feel good about that, and I'm not going to kind of have the baggage around it. So that's a tough nut to crack. It's hard to create that kind of environment, but we're going to talk a little bit more in the next section about some things that maybe you can start applying, little ways of like if you think about teams like this, what are the little things that you could do to help encourage that kind of thinking or feeling on your teams? So a few of the questions. How are you creating an environment on your teams for collaboration to thrive? And then a couple more questions. Does your team feel like a group of individuals working off a checklist, or does it feel like a team of people solving problems together? Explain how this works in your environment. So just take some time to think through that. How do you make decisions within a team? Is it clear? Does it vary based off of the type of work? So that gets into the knowns versus unknowns. Does everyone on your team feel like their skills are respected and valued? Do they feel encouraged to voice their opinions and share their views about the work? Can people disagree and commit? And another thing here, when, what, and how does your team celebrate? So I think like that celebration aspect, just kind of building good feelings as people working together. Like what are the things that you celebrate together? So it kind of gets into what does success look like and how do we create that kind of encouraging feeling on a team. The other kind of parting note for this topic is alignment has a lot to do with how well this works, right? So if you give that direction and you say, this is the hill we're going to take and we're not taking these other hills, so don't worry about these things, I think that's a critical component for the team to be able to know when we're having these discussions, when we're making a decision, what are we kind of referencing as a benchmark for how we know if that's the right decision, right? And if you give a clear North Star, you'll hear people talk about North Star goals or North Star alignment. Like is there that one thing, that mission that you have that the team can use as kind of the ruler for how good a decision is? So it's not about your idea is a bad idea. It's about how does this idea compare to the goal that we're trying to achieve. So we'll touch on that again in a second here too. This next idea here is what I call habits as process. So, and this is, I think, just a mental trick to get us out of the trap of what we usually think about process as. You hear the word process, you kind of think of a big heavy thing. So some definitions here. Process is a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. So we feel kind of bogged down by process, right? That feels like a bad word sometimes. But if you kind of think about it a different way, think about what the word habit means. It means a settled or regular tendency or practice, especially one that is hard to give up. So there's some similarities here, right? And so the big idea to take away from this is that if you take your process and instead of thinking about it as steps in a process, think about your process as a series of things that are either good habits or bad habits. And like, how would you know, and how do you feel about those things? So a process then becomes something that is, if you think about good habits, you're doing good habits because they're helping you achieve something. And if you think about your process, are the steps in your process good habits or bad habits as far as helping you achieve that thing? So not all processes, if you just take a common process framework and try to use somebody else's rule book or playbook, right? There's going to be things that process was built on that maybe don't apply in your situation, to your type of work, to your context. So you need to take that into account and then decide for yourself, does this work for my team? Does this particular part of this process, is it like a good habit for our team? Is it a bad habit? Like, how would you think about that? So to start putting some of this stuff into action, I really like the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. Has anyone else read Atomic Habits, heard of it? Okay, I love this book. I think I'm on my 4th or 5th time listening to the audiobook. I really think it's great. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. So I will share a few of the things that are in that book with you and how I think that can start to apply to some of these areas. So he talks about the core loop, like what makes up a habit. So a habit is made up of a cue, a craving, a response, and a reward. So he defines most habits will have that kind of characteristic to it. But then he also defines what he calls the laws of behavior change, which are then associated to those things. So he says, if you want to create a good habit, you need to make it obvious. If you want to, so the top is good habit here. So good habits, you need to make it obvious that you need to do it. You need to make it attractive to do. You need to make it easy to do, and you need to make it satisfying. So if you can create those things, if you can do these things for something new that you're trying, that's how you're going to be able to get it to stick, right? And if you identify something as a bad habit, you do the opposite to kind of dissolve a bad habit, right? You make it invisible, you make it unattractive, you make it hard, or you make it unsatisfying. So, and then he also talks about identity. So if you're trying to achieve a new identity, so if you're applying this to like your team and you say like, maybe we want to be more customer feedback driven, right? But if right now we're not getting any feedback from our customers, we may feel like we're the anti that, right? So like, how do you get from being not something to embodying that identity? And this is where he has the idea of the 1% gain, so he calls it the aggregation of marginal gain. So little tiny habits build on each other. And the thing that's cool here is he says that every action is a vote for the identity. So every time that you're doing something that is aligning with that new identity, you are essentially creating a body of evidence for being that thing, right? So if you want to be a writer, every time you write, you are a writer. So the more and more that you write, there's more and more proof that you are that thing. So think about that from the team perspective of how would you start applying that to your team. So I clipped this part of the book, I think is really good. So he says, 4 laws of behavior change. You have a set of tools and strategies that you can use to build better systems and shape better habits. So he says, sometimes a habit will be hard to remember and you need to make it obvious. Other times you won't feel like starting and you'll need to make it attractive. In many cases, you'll find that a habit will be too difficult and you'll need to make it easy. And sometimes you won't feel like sticking with it and you'll need to make it satisfying. So take this and apply that to the steps in your process and how you're thinking about those as habits. And I think it might help you decide what would you do to make the kind of difference that you want. And you can also then think about this concept that he has of habit stacking. So like the best way to build a new habit is to build it on top of an existing one. So you already have a set of behavior that's ingrained in you or your team or your organization. So if you wanted to make a change, figure out what that change is, that small first vote for some new type of identity, and try to bolt it on to an existing practice, an existing thing. So you can say, when old thing or current thing is happening, we will add in this new thing, right? So that's kind of the idea there. So some questions around this. Are you blindly following a popular process, or are you methodically building up a system of habits that focuses your resources on what really matters? And a couple more here. Is your team clear on what the process is? If not, how could you document what is actually happening for a while, like doing a journal or something? How do you know if people are getting value out of the process or just going through the motions? Are process steps good habits or bad ones? Is there anything on your team that feels unclear or clunky that a new habit could help improve? How could you tie that to a new or existing one? And how could you apply the laws of habit change to create good habits or bad ones? All right. Any questions so far? Keep moving on. All right. So the next topic here is this idea of traction and optionality. So what do I mean by that? And I'll share first, there's this great quote by Bob Mesta, who's one of the architects of the jobs to be done framework, if you're familiar with that. He says, context creates value and contrast creates meaning. So where the thing is at, or where the idea is at, where the situation is at, like what the context around that is kind of how you get value out of something. Like that's where the definition of value comes from. Which I think is great. I think a lot of the jobs to be done research kind of focuses on that idea of the context and the value. But what I love about this quote is actually the second part of it. And this has been super impactful for me to think about things, which is contrast creates meaning. So if he gives this great example of if you go to a full fridge that has beverages in it and you open up the door, and like you don't necessarily make a decision instantly when you get there about what you want. You make a decision based off of eliminating things, right? So you open the door and it's, no, I don't want beer, I don't want wine, like I don't want like a cola soda, I want more of a lime soda, or so it's like it's elimination. The brain tends to think more by elimination and elimination by comparison, right? Like it's hard to describe A or give meaning to what A is without looking at B or C. So it's the comparisons between things that actually help you give some definition to what those things are. So I think that's a really useful concept to start applying. So how could you use this in your actual work? That's where I think this you may recognize. I think we've all seen these tree structures. These have been around for a long time. The popular one that's kind of rising in the product space right now is Teresa Torres's opportunity solution tree. This is modeled off of one of her diagrams. So you have an outcome that you want to achieve. For that, there may be multiple different opportunities that you could tackle. So you could think of the opportunities as the hills to take. We want to achieve this result. What are the opportunities that we could do that would help move us in that direction, right? There may be lots of them. So you have to pick one, or maybe more than one, but usually you have to start somewhere. So there's always picking one to start with at some point in time. There may be sub opportunities. Then at some point you kind of break this line between the solution or the problem or the opportunity space and like I'm tactically building something, right? So when you start thinking in screens or tools, you're kind of moving into this solution space. And then even once you get there, once you are saying that it's going to be a feature in this web app, that's still not completely defined yet either, right? It could, like, how are you going to manifest that feature? What is the screens going to actually look like? Where are you going to put the controls at on the screens, or things like that, right? And that's where we get into these experiments. So what kind of experiments that could you do to validate, like, is that the right solution? Is it the optimal solution? So you can think in this tree structure. But the thing that I think is interesting in this is where you do those comparison and contrast types of decisions, right? So so I talk about traction. There's two kind of competing things that whenever a team kind of starts on new work, you have this, number one, you have this kind of craving for traction. People want to feel momentum. They want to move forward. They want to get started, right? And they want to see some value like as fast as possible. I think agile software development has kind of pushed developers to be by default in that mode. I see that a lot. Like, developers tend to think in that, like, let's get started, let's demo something, right? And like, that's good. Like, it's good to have a bias toward action. It's good to move. It's good to create momentum for the team. It's good to start building things. But there's also some downsides to that as well. So as soon as you start building something, you have somewhat of a sunk cost, right? You've put time and effort and energy into something, and now there's a tendency to want to keep putting time and effort and energy into that, whether it's the right thing or not. So the question then becomes, how do you know if it's actually the right thing or not? And if you haven't done the optionality piece, if you haven't created anything else to compare that thing to, then you won't know, right? You won't know if it's the right thing until it's done and it fails or it succeeds, right? So how could you know earlier? How could you have some better thought through that process? And that's where you can kind of start thinking about this tree structure. So it's okay to start a project and have your gut feel for what you think the right approach is and to start doing some work on it. But you should also at the same time do some level of optionality generation. So for the outcome, you could say, we think this is going to be the right opportunity, but do a little bit of work to think about how else might what are the other options that we could have. And specifically, I would encourage you to generate kind of a pro-con list for each of those. Like, so if you had these other 2 or 3 opportunities, like for the North Star outcome for what we're trying to achieve, what are the pros and cons for that opportunity in relation to this big objective that we're trying to achieve? If we're trying to be faster to the market, well, then how does this opportunity make us faster? How is it not so great at making us faster? And then do that for the next one and the next one, right? And then you can apply the same kind of thinking at really any level of this tree. You could do it from the solution space, right? You can say, we're gonna build this interface. Well, like, we're gonna build it because we're trying to achieve this thing with it. And of these 3 ways of building the screens, what are the pros and the cons? And so comparing it against your objective for whatever that level of the tree is helps you kind of define those pros and cons. And then you can also then compare each solution against each other and do all the permutations of, like, how is A compared to B? How is A compared to C? How is B compared to C? And like, by doing those comparisons, you start to see the benefits or the trade-offs that you're making by choosing one versus the other. And sometimes just doing that exercise lets you generate something that you never would have thought of to start with because you've done this comparative analysis to think about it. So the other part about this though is that it sounds like a lot of work. It doesn't have to be. You could time box and say, all right, team, we know we're going down this road, we're doing this direction, but let's spend an hour or 2 hours at a whiteboard thinking about how else might we do wherever we're kind of at in this tree structure. And then that will just give you more information. And I would think that by doing that, you will either see a better way and you'll adjust where you're going, or it may help validate that like, yep, we're down the right path, and you are now more confident because you know that you're going down this default path, not because it's the default path, you're going down it because it's more of a deliberate choice, right? You've created a, it's something that you've chosen to do versus something that just kind of happened, right? That also has the benefit of, by having more, when you have one line of work, it's usually driven by somebody's idea, right? And so it becomes about, do I like this idea or not, right? And if you have these options and you're comparing it against an outcome, you're starting to do these compare and contrasting work or things that you can do instead of talking about, I like that, I don't like that, or kind of by proxy, I like you or I don't like you, right? So like having this kind of thinking, like you have to have that right team environment like we were talking about, but it also is like a cyclical thing. If you have this, it also helps you move away from the types of conversations or default paths that would encourage you to do things that actually degrades a team as well. So there's kind of a self-feeding type thing there. So again, this does several things. It builds confidence on the path that you're doing. It helps you tell a story. This tree, you can kind of walk down and say, we're building this solution because we're doing this opportunity and we're trying to achieve this, and it's going to help us drive toward the outcome. So it actually gives you the outline to tell a story, which is kind of cool. It helps you catch nuances you might otherwise miss. It gives you possibilities if your gut is off the mark. So if you start down the default path and you start to see some things that aren't going well, and you're like, oh, this isn't going great, but remember that other one we talked about a month ago? Like that one was great for some of these things. Like maybe we should pivot, right? And so it gives you some context to know when should you pivot or when should you kind of keep going on something. And it combines the best variations of your options, and it helps to shift the focus from choices to two choices from opinion battles. This tool I really like, kind of in this alignment space and teaming, like all this. This is a tool for optionality and traction that is a little bit more in the alignment space. So you have a goal, and then you break it down into things that you know and things that you assume. So you know where you need to just move forward and where you need to invest some time. And then you say the things that you don't want to do, like we don't want to lose money, we don't want to lose users, we don't want to. It gives you some things that you're not willing to give up, right? We're going to watch these metrics when we do this change to make sure that we're not moving backwards. And then you also articulate, we're going to try to achieve this by trying these things, and you give out the solutions or the things that you're going to do. And then this just keeps nesting. So for each of those things, you could do facts and assumptions and things that you want to keep. And you could have sub things that you're trying to make those things happen. So this tree structure works. But what I really like about this is this knowns versus assumptions, and kind of the, what do we want to make sure that we're not losing? This is a assumptions map by John Cutler. If you're familiar with John Cutler, he's got a lot of great stuff online, but this is one of his slides I think has been helpful. Okay, so a few questions in this space. Are you effectively gaining traction on ideas quickly while you're also ensuring to make the best decisions? And think about the last few things your team did. Did you spend time evaluating diverging things, ways to solve the issue at hand? How could you make some tweaks to your process to help keep your options open? Can you break your work into smaller pieces so you can learn quickly? How might you encourage this type of thinking in your current process? And this last part, I think, is a good exercise just to kind of get your feet wet in this area. So like think about what's the next thing on your plate that you're trying to do right now, and just take some time box an hour or two, and try to generate some options, try to do some of these pro-con lists and comparisons, and then just see like, how do I feel about trying this out? Like, did I learn something? Do I feel better about the path I was already on? Did I choose a new path? Like, did I create some other option? Like this is a kind of a quick and easy way to try to test that out. Okay. So the last section to talk about here is this concept of feedback, which I think we're all familiar, I think, with what I would say is the #1 definition of feedback, which is information or about reactions to a product, which is used as a basis for improvement. I think that's what we usually think about, what feedback would mean. That's the definition most people would come to mind with. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about definition #2, which is the modification or control of a process or system by its results or effects. So it's a little bit more of a systems thinking, systems dynamics, complexity viewpoint on what feedback means. And that's why I have the little icon drawings down there of stocks, flows, and delays. So if you start getting into system thinking, you'll hear about stocks, which are kind of like the level of the water, right? Flows, what's coming in, what's going out. Like, what are the rates of those flows? How does that affect the water level kind of in your system? So I like to think of, in Agile, you can think of flows as things coming into the backlog. The stock is your backlog, and the things going out of the backlog that are done, like those are stocks and flows. And then there are also like information or things that you're doing as a part of the work that are kind of feeding or flowing into that process, right? So like, how are you kind of, what is the steady state? Do you even know what the steady state is? Do you know how like things will affect your system from that perspective? So stocks and flows are interesting, but the key thing for this part is this concept of delays. That's what I want to talk a little bit more and give you some ideas about. So one of the things I really think that we fall down on a lot is in the area of feedback is not accounting for delays, or assuming that a delay is by default zero, zero time, right? There is no, when I need to get feedback from a user, there will instantly, I'll snap my fingers and a user will magically poof into existence and give me like the feedback on this interface that I want, right? Or they'll tell me like what I need to know about it, right? So it takes time to get feedback. It takes time, #1, to develop the asset that you need to get feedback on, to kind of frame and think about the things that you need to get out of that feedback, like what questions are driving the feedback. Very rarely do we just say, what do you think about this thing? Like that's a good thing to do, but you also usually will have somewhat of an agenda on what do I think how do I think that they're going to react to this, right? So there's time to do that. There's time to then, once you get feedback or reactions, you have to make some sense of that, right? Like, what do they mean? What was valuable? What wasn't? And then you have to put it back into the system, and it has to be able to somehow kind of go through the pipeline again. And like, what is the cycle time for that to happen? If you do feedback and you get it and the user's had some stuff, and then you put it in a backlog, and then it's, you know, no way it's ever going to get done until maybe 2 years from now, right? Then that starts reinforcing this idea of that, you know, backlogs are a place where things go to die, right? Or that like, why did we spend all this time and effort talking to users? Because it didn't matter, right? They told us some stuff, it made us feel either good or bad. And then we just, you know, the train keeps going, the momentum just keeps chugging along. So, and I don't think that's because feedback is bad. It's more of this concept around time. So when you think about feedback, think about timing. How does time play into it? So I like to think about this concept of a time wall. So like, how can you constrain your process putting a time box in for feedback, and what kind of feedback do you want in different kind of time horizons, right? Like, do you get feedback when something's finished? Do you get feedback at the beginning? Like, is there like what kind of things in your process, what habits could you introduce into your process, right? And where could you do something that would trigger a certain kind of feedback that you would want to get? So, and the time wall is kind of, it's a deadline, right? We will not go longer than this, or we will not let this trigger happen without having some feedback in that we can still have time then to do something with it, right? You want to get feedback that you can act upon, and not just feedback that is, you know, if it's not something you can do. I think I had, yeah, so I had this thing like, you need to have time to cycle through this whole thing and back so that it actually will make a difference. The other concept I think is useful is in smaller pieces of time, you will get, when you ask for feedback, you're probably going to get a certain amount of information back. And you'll say, oh, that's interesting. You'll make some sense of it. It'll go back into your process. The longer that you wait, when you do get that feedback, you will probably get a similar amount of information, right? And so if you're doing it in these big, long cycles, you're going to get either a high granularity level of information that may not be very useful because it's so high level, because there's so much you're trying to get people to comment on or talk about, or so much that you're trying to get information on. It's just too much, right? And so you're either going to get not useful information, or you're going to get a flood of information, and it's going to be like, well, I don't know what to do with this. It's too much, right? So I think these small little pieces of feedback give you smaller bits of information that make sense of, which makes it easier to reintroduce them in and actually do something about them, versus one big long time delay and then a huge amount of feedback. It creates the too long didn't read kind of effect, right? Like, oh, okay, we have this mountain of information now. Now we have all this work to do something about it, and it's not even going to make a difference until a long time from now. So when you think about feedback, account for delays, identify reinforcing and balancing loops. So know the things that are going to kind of ramp things up or ramp things down. There's kind of these natural points. That's kind of another concept from systems thinking that I didn't really touch on as much here, but it's still something you could go look into. The bigger part is the idea of the right info at the right time, in the right granularity, and then knowing how time is going to impact those delays. So, and the feedback you're getting, I think the time frame could affect the actual tools and techniques that you use. Some things may need interviewing with users. Some things you may be able to, if you have a big SaaS product, you may be able to do some, analytics type thing where you say, like, what is the behavior? Are people clicking on this button, or how many people went through this flow, or things like that. So just think about what tools apply to what kinds of feedback, and then the time horizon that you're trying to get to those on. So some questions in this area: are you designing effective feedback loops to intentionally validate your decisions or uncover opportunities? And then these kind of are questions to dig into what we've talked about. Have you planned ways of getting feedback on your work? How often do you get your feedback from customers, from coworkers, from stakeholders, from whoever matters? Are there any habits you can add to your team that would encourage feedback to happen earlier? When you gather feedback, how is it shared? Is there enough time for it to have an impact on the outcomes of your team? If not, what habits could you create to improve this? And then this last one, I think this is actually one of the most impactful ones, is how good is your team at asking quality questions, and how might you become better inquisitors as a team? So I think by default, people in general are pretty bad at asking the right kinds of questions, because when we grow up, right, people ask us a lot of yes, no, close-ended, there's one answer kind of questions. Like, that's what we get trained on in school. There's one answer, right? And then you kind of get out into the real world, into this fog of war kind of situation, right? And like, there isn't one answer. There's lots of different kinds of answers, and you need to be able to evaluate choices and look at the nuances and kind of be able to get the right information out. That usually comes by getting stories out of people. That comes from asking them open-ended questions. It comes from asking them ways that they've done things in the past that they've actually invested real time or energy into. So that there are some techniques and kind of mindsets that you can apply that will help you level up being a better question asker, so that you actually will start getting the kind of feedback you want. Because if you just say, like, would you like this product, or would you buy this, right? Like, I think that's so common in market research. Like, would you buy this? How much money would you pay for it? And a lot of times, like, it's not compared to anything, right? So people just like pull these answers out of the air, or they give you some guess on what they think that you want. And if you ask them instead, like, when was the last time you bought something like this? When did you buy it? How much did you pay for it? Did you feel like it was worth the money, right? Like, those become better ways to get them to start telling you, oh, back at this point in time, I did this. And it kind of opens up a view into their world, and it gets them into the storytelling mode, and you can kind of get all of that information will come out naturally. And then you can kind of sense make, like, what do I want to do with that? How does that apply to our product or our business or our user interface or whatever it is that you're trying to move forward? So this questioning kind of thing is something I'm somewhat fascinated with. So if anyone else wants to geek out over that, like, I am more than happy to share lots of resources, or the little few resources I have, because there's really not a lot of stuff out there on how to do this well. So happy to talk more about that. So just kind of summarize here, we talked about these 5 buckets. So in order to create the environment that you need for the things that the ways of work that you're doing, in order for them to be effective and meaningful, and for it to feel good and have people that, love coming to work every day, you need some form of alignment and direction, and you need a team that is engaged and can kind of take that direction and do something with it, and energized, right? And then how do you achieve that? Well, you need to think about things and habits, so you can improve. You need to be able to give that feeling of momentum while also giving yourself choices and kind of a framework for making the right decisions. And then you need to think about, how do you know that the things you're doing are the right things, and making sure that, you don't wait too long. You leave yourself time to evaluate your choices and kind of make a difference on things. So again, these things are lenses for systematic improvements. They're not things that you can win at. They are kind of all infinite game concepts, right? The things that you keep doing. So I encourage you to think about this as like a mental framework for thinking about the ways that you do work. And the other thing is that these are all kind of, I like to think of it as like a rubber band ball. They're all kind of this knot of things together, right? So in order to have any one of these be effective, you have to have some level of all of the rest of them, right? And so, and they feed back together, right? So you can have habits or traction or optionality or feedback on how well aligned you are, or how effective you're being as a team, right? So they can go the other way too. You can use these tactics to improve the first part, and then kind of work back and forth. So kind of think about, I would encourage you that any of these areas, if you think about kind of a rubric, like if you were going to make a change in one of these areas, how easily do you think you could move the needle? Do you think if you put some effort into it, you could move the needle on that thing? And like, how happy are you with kind of where you're at in using these concepts on your team? And then whichever ones are kind of the biggest gap, right? Focus on the area that you can make, some improvement or see some movement on. So try to kind of raise the water level on all of these things together, and you kind of got to work back and forth to kind of get them to kind of all evolve in concert together. So that's the information I had for tonight. That brings us to close to the end of our time. So I do have I don't have the big list of questions. I have this small list of questions on printed out here. So if people want to hang out and kind of talk about these and get some kind of riff off each other to see how people are doing it in their environments, that's cool. If you have to take off for the evening, that's great too. But thanks everyone. Appreciate your time. Hopefully it's valuable. Any questions?
That was the talk. I hope everyone enjoyed that and got a lot of good information out of it. If you are interested in talking more, I just wanted to encourage you again to check out the links in the description for both how to get a hold of me and how to find the local Product Tank meetup here in Indianapolis, so that you can maybe attend, or either virtually or in person. And so yeah, we'd love to see you at a meetup soon, and I would love to hear anyone that has more questions or ideas about the content. Definitely something I'm going to be putting out more content for. So if you got value out of this presentation, feel free to hit that like button, and also to subscribe to the channel so you get notified when there's new content available. So thanks for tuning in. Catch you later.